welcome Shinnecock people. My name is Paige. I'm the teen brain at Lethbridge Public Library here in Lethbridge, kind of sort of next door to you when you're, at school and not learning from home online. If you ever have library questions, once we're open to the public again, pop over, say hi, ask me questions. I'm happy to answer them. And in the meantime, if you have library questions, you can email me. My email address is on the library's website, and the library's website is lethlib.ca. We also have an Instagram account where all of the teen stuff gets posted. It is at LPL Teen Zone, all one word. And so you can find new things that have arrived at the library, programs, all that good stuff. But today we have a very special event brought to you from the library and your school and the Canadian Children's Books Centre, and our very special guest, author Michelle Barker. So welcome to Michelle.
Hello, everyone.
Michelle is joining us from BC. We're here in Lethbridge, and one thing I always like to bring people's minds to before we start a library program is that the Lethbridge Public Library is in Lethbridge, and Lethbridge is on the traditional lands of the Blackfoot people here on the plains. Lethbridge is also part of the lands used by the Métis Nation Region 3, and it's important to keep that in mind and keep cultures and traditions, respect and exploration, because we're a library, all of that in mind. So Michelle, like I said, is in Vancouver. She is an author of some fantastic YA books. And Michelle, unfortunately, because of my technological difficulties earlier, I no longer have your bio in front of me.
Oh,
no. But I believe there's some interesting facts that you shared, possibly involving some pets.
Yes, well, and that'll come up. Actually, I did in my bio mention my bad cat, who is my roommate. And at the very end, when there's time for questions, you'll see some pictures of my bad cat. So it's all good.
Fantastic. So my apologies for not giving you a full bio. But yes, computer is in update land, running off of an iPad.
All good.
Because it's morning. Anyhow, welcome to all you students. If you have questions, you should be able to access, or your teacher should be able to access the Q&A and the chat. Just gonna check a couple things here. Yeah, so we can see the chat. Excellent. So you can toss in questions for Michelle in there. I will keep an eye on the chat and share those questions with Michelle. We'll probably do the presentation first, and then we'll do a whole bunch of questions at the end. So if you have a question during the presentation, you can type it in and I will jot it down for later, or you can jot it down and then put it in later, and we'll do a whole swath of questions at the end. All right, excellent. So Michelle, without further ado, I'm gonna mute my stuff, turn it over to you, and we can hear all about your writing.
Okay, awesome. I'm just going to share my screen first of all, make sure that this all works out here. So hopefully you guys can all see that. So I first want to say, yes, I am joining you from Vancouver, and Vancouver is on the unceded traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. So I wanted also to thank you guys for inviting me to be here today. It's awesome. I wish I could see you. I wish I could be in front of you, but in any case, this is better than nothing. So I'm going to talk to you today about my novel, The House of 1000 Eyes. And I'm going to talk to you about a bit of German history. And I will admit, give you full disclosure that when I was your age, history was not something that particularly interested me, but this history is going to sound a little bit like it comes out of a James Bond movie. It's pretty incredible, especially if you've never heard anything about it. You're probably going to think that I'm making some of this up, but I can assure you that everything I'm going to tell you today actually happened. So there is going to be time at the end for questions. There are going to be also a few moments where I'm going to ask for your opinion or ask what you think about certain things. So we'll have little bits of time for discussion part of the way through as well. So I'm first going to play you the trailer that my publisher, Anik Press, made for this book. And I hope it's going to work because it's really cool. They did such a wonderful job with it. So this is a bit of an experiment, but we're going to try this out and hopefully you guys can see and hear it. So here goes. Good. Hopefully that worked. So I have written a couple of other books about Germany. A Year of Borrowed Men is a picture book that is set in Germany during World War II and actually based on a true story. And my long list of impossible things is set in Germany just after World War II comes to an end. And then I'm actually working on one right now that is set in Germany in 1929 before the Nazis come to power. So you're probably thinking, okay, this is a pretty weird and random obsession that this author has, but it actually really isn't that random because my mom is German. So these are a couple of pictures of her. She's actually still alive and she's going to be turning 85 in a couple of weeks. And she lives in Vancouver, so I get to see her all the time. But when she was a little girl, she lived in Germany while Hitler was in power. And then her family, when the Soviets arrived in their part of Germany at the end of the war, her family was kicked out of their home in much the way I describe it in my book, My Long List of Impossible Things. So she ended up with her family in the Soviet zone of Germany. And that is the part of Germany that became East Germany in about 1949. And my mom actually, luckily for her, escaped from East Germany. She snuck out when she was about 17. She had a temporary travel visa that you could get at that time. And one of her older sisters was in West Germany. So she packed a small bag pretending that she was just going away for the weekend. And she left and she never came back. And it was actually a pretty lucky thing that she did that when she did, because some years later, she probably wouldn't have been able to get away with that. So she was pretty lucky that she got out. So I'm going to back up just a little bit and give you some background about East Germany and sort of what I'm going to be talking about, just so you understand how this all started and where it all came from. So when World War II ended, Germany lost that war, and the country was divided into 4 zones of occupation: the British, French, American, and Soviet. And the capital, Berlin, was also divided into these 4 zones. So this seemed like it was probably going to be a good arrangement at the time, but then the Soviet Union decided that they were going to put communist governments into all these different Eastern European countries. And the world started to divide in East versus West, and this was how the Cold War began. So Germany also divided into East versus West, and so did the capital, Berlin. So the Soviet zone became East Germany, and the rest of the country became West Germany. So Stalin was the leader of the Soviet Union at that time, and pretty soon what he did was he sealed off all of these countries from the rest of the world. And Winston Churchill called this the Iron Curtain. And mainly because the Soviet Union separated these countries in a way that nobody really knew what was going on over there. And you couldn't get in and you couldn't get out. So the idea behind it was that, these were all communist countries. And so they were going to keep them communist by shutting out all Western influences and, no capitalism, none of that. But in practical terms, what this meant is that they had to control almost everything that people were doing. They had to control the books they were reading, the television they saw, where they went, who they spoke to. And in order to do this, they installed secret police forces in all of these countries. So over time, it became harder and harder to leave East Germany. But very soon, leaders realized that there was a weak link. And the weak link was Berlin, because if you remember, I showed you that Berlin was also divided into East versus West. So people in East Berlin realized that all they had to do basically was take a train and they could get into West Berlin and then they could get out. And so that's what they started doing. And a ton of them started going because they realized they didn't want to live like this. This was terrible. So on August 13th, 1961, literally overnight, the authorities put down 160 kilometers of barbed wire across the city of Berlin. And this is what eventually became the Berlin Wall. And the Berlin Wall, of course, was not a barbed wire. It was a concrete structure. There were watchtowers, there were guard dogs, there were electric fences, there were guards with guns, and there were lights that were so bright you could see them from space. So the top of the wall was rounded so that you really couldn't climb over it. And I'll show you a picture in a few minutes. And people on one side of the wall were not allowed to go to the other side, even if the rest of their family was there. If you were on one side of the wall, you were stuck. That's where you were. If you snuck out and you were caught, you either could be shot on the spot, even though technically they weren't supposed to do that, but they did, or you could face a prison term from anywhere from 2 to 8 years. If you weren't caught, the people who you left behind would be punished in your place. So what this meant was your parents might lose their jobs. They could be arrested. They were treated like outcasts. So basically it was a lose-lose situation. People, as you might imagine, tried everything to get out. They dug tunnels. They went through sewers. They went over by hot air balloon. They went over by zip line. There are some amazing movies and stories of true life escapes from East Germany and East Berlin. It's very cool. But the statistics are not so great. Only 1 in 15 escape attempts was actually successful. Approximately 5,000 East Germans over the whole period of time made it across the border. About 250 people died trying to climb the Berlin Wall, and another 370 died along the border between East and West Germany. Now, the authorities were also monitoring the Baltic Sea, so you were not allowed to swim at night or go diving or go boating, because they figured out pretty quickly that that was how people were going to sneak out. But unfortunately, 189 people died trying to get out that way. And altogether, 72,000 people were put in jail for trying to escape and failing. So if you go to Berlin now, you can actually still see parts of the wall. Parts of the wall have been kept up and they've been turned into a gallery. And there's some beautiful artwork that's been done on there. It's really very, very nice. But the thing that is amazing, first of all, here you can see the rounded top, and you can see how hard it would be to climb up over that. But the other thing that's really amazing is how high the wall is. The wall it's really, really high. And the thing is that climbing over that's only the first part, because then you get into the middle, the no man's land, where there's the guard dogs and the people with the guns and all of that. And so, you know, it would have been very, very hard to escape. So here's another example of the artwork, and they've put up fences because unfortunately what people do is deface them with graffiti, as you can see here. But in this picture, this shows the perspective. You can see how small the people are and how big the wall is. The wall was huge. It was crazy. So it's pretty cool. I was in Berlin and I got to see this and had a feeling for what it actually would have felt like. But what I want to ask you guys, I'm going to throw this question out to you, is would you have risked escaping if the people who you left behind would have been punished in your place? And also keep in mind, the risk means that you get over the wall and somebody might shoot you. They weren't supposed to, as I said, in East German law, technically they weren't supposed to shoot anybody. In reality, they shot everybody. Even if you were a woman, even if you were a child, it didn't matter. If you were climbing over that wall and they found you, there's a good chance you'd get shot. So would you have risked it? Now, I'll have to talk a little bit more, I guess, so that you can see how bad life was in East Germany before you can make that decision. But I'm just wondering how everybody feels about that whole scenario.
And you guys can type in the chat and I can share that.
Okay.
So that everybody can hear.
Okay.
Or Taryn, if you want to just share your audio, we can do that too.
Yeah, I'm sharing my audio. Students, if you can hear, so actually it's an interesting group of students to have talking to, because some of them have already maybe made some escapes from dangerous places. So what do you think, guys? If you were in a place and it wasn't going very well, would you try and escape? Would you stay put and try and be safe? You would try, Rosine? I'm not sure if Michelle and Paige, if you can hear the students or not.
Not quite, no.
I'll type in the chat. That might be easier.
Perfect. Yeah, and then I
Sure.
can read
Yeah.
out loud and everybody
Okay,
can.
yeah, that'd be awesome. It's a pretty tough question because you're putting your family possibly at risk, right? I mean, you don't know necessarily what's going to happen to them if you leave them behind. And I know there were some parents who said to their kids, look, we want you to have a better life, even if it means I might lose my job. I want you to go. I want you to try and go and make something of yourself somewhere else where you actually have a future. But that didn't even necessarily mean that they'd be able to get through, right? It was a huge risk that people were taking.
There you go. So Rosine says, yes, she would try.
Okay, interesting. Well, I tell you what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about East Germany and what life was like, and then maybe ask the question again and see
For
how
sure.
you feel after you hear more about it. Oh, is there another answer?
Yeah, Taryn
Okay.
says, some of our students have come to Canada from other countries and have had to make this hard choice.
Oh, that's amazing. That's very interesting. Okay, well, I'm sure we'll have lots to talk about. Lots to talk about at the end. That's, yeah, very interesting perspective. Okay, so I'm going to just continue on a little bit more here. So the truth is, actually, I never really intended to write this novel. I had gone to Berlin doing research on My Long List of Impossible Things, which was the other novel that I was writing at the time. And I had been reading a bunch of books about the secret police in East Germany who were known as the Stasi. And so I got to Berlin and I found out that Stasi headquarters, which was located in Berlin, they'd turned their main building into a museum. And I thought, oh, that's kind of cool. I'm going to go over and I'm going to check it out. And this building in the picture looks pretty boring, right? I mean, it doesn't really look like anything very interesting, but this was the building that Berliners used to call the House of 1,000 Eyes. And this was the center of all the secret police, basically. The main guy who ran the secret police, Erich Mielke, had his office there, and they've preserved it in exactly the way it would have looked like when he was working there, which was very, very cool. But the other thing that they had in there was all the methods of surveillance that the secret police used to follow East Germans and find out what they were doing. And I'm going to talk a lot more about that in detail, but all I can tell you right now is I walked in there and I took one look at that stuff and I thought, I am writing a novel about this because this is crazy. So I'm going to read just a short excerpt from the book. I'll tell you just a little bit more that you might not have gotten from the trailer. So Lena is the main character, and she lives with her aunt, and her aunt is a staunch Communist Party supporter and not a particularly pleasant person. Lena's parents have been killed in a factory accident, and she really struggled after that. She ended up in a mental institute for a while. It was very traumatic. And the one thing that she really looks forward to in her life is the time she gets to spend with her uncle. So every Sunday she goes to see her uncle across town, and he's a writer. And so basically when the novel starts, she's gone to see her uncle. They've had a visit, but there's something wrong. And she can tell there's something is not right with him. He has these precious writing notebooks of his that he never lets anybody read. He handed them over to a neighbor for safekeeping, which she thought was very strange. So she goes home, she's worried. She can't sleep that night. She finally thinks, okay, that's it. I'm sneaking out of my aunt's place. I'm going back to see what's going on with my uncle. I can't sleep. I need to find out what's wrong. So that's basically where we're at when I start this excerpt. So I'll just read a couple pages to you. Lena stood with her back flattened against the building across the street, one hand tracing a shell hole. She looked up. The lights were off, but the curtains were open. The lights were off, but when Lena looked hard and harder, she could see a shadow moving around inside. And then on the street, someone coughed, and she nearly jumped out of her shoes. That was when she realized the dark street, which had seemed empty and sleeping, was neither. The cough came from a man standing in the doorway of Eric's building. There was a flower shop van parked in front, and a man sitting at the wheel, as if he planned to make an urgent delivery of roses. Eyes, everywhere, eyes. Lena made herself small, pressing as hard as she could into the wall and wishing she'd thought to hide herself better. In Eric's apartment, a window opened and a man made a signal, but the man was not Eric. He had a bushy beard and he had the wrong hair to be one of Eric's friends. The flower delivery man started the van and drove away. Another van pulled up and more men entered the building. Where had they gotten the key? The front door was locked every night at 10 p.m. Now they were coming out with Eric's things, his typewriter, his books, a suitcase. What was happening? Where was Eric? What would he think when he came home and all his important things were missing? Another suitcase. And then came the notebooks. The men must have found them at Steffi's apartment. Was she in trouble too? Lena wanted to run out and stop them, but she couldn't do that. You didn't get in the way of men like this, or you ended up in the blank space on the map. Eric said the blank space was really the Stasi prison, and that terrible things happened there, but how could it be? Weren't spaces left blank on city maps because nothing was there? What had he done? All his notebooks. The Stasi men would sit there with their cigars and beer steins and read the notebooks out loud to one another and laugh. What if they didn't give them back? The men gathered in the doorway of Eric's building, 3 of them, speaking in voices too low for Lena to overhear. 2 got into the van and drove away. 1 got into a Lada and didn't. He rolled down the window, lit a cigarette, took out a newspaper, and sat there. Find Eric and warn him about what's waiting for him when he comes home. That was the most important thing. He must be at the pub. Lena edged away from the man in the Lada. He wouldn't notice her anyway. She was just a girl. No one ever noticed her, which sometimes made her sad, but there were advantages, except Auntie. Auntie had eyes all over her head when it came to Lena. So I thought we should talk a little bit about the differences between East and West Germany so you can get an idea of how life would have been very, very different if you had grown up on the wrong side of the wall. So if you were a teenager in West Germany in the 1980s, you probably would have listened to music like Bruce Springsteen or David Bowie. These are probably people you've never heard of before because I'm a little older than you guys. But anyways, the point is that you would have been able to listen to whatever music you wanted to. If you lived in the East, that was not true because all of these these bands and everything were considered Western influences and they were not allowed. So, but the government controlled the music that happened in East Germany, and they would look at the lyrics and make sure that the songs weren't criticizing the government. So punk rock actually became a form of rebellion in Berlin because it was a way for people to make a statement. But the problem was that if you dressed like a punk rocker, you were basically asking to be arrested. Yeah, just for what you were wearing. The authorities were constantly harassing people who looked like that. But the picture on the bottom is of a band that was more mainstream in East Germany. They were popular in the 1970s and they were called Renft. But as their music continued, they started to get a little bit more subversive. And so what would happen if you were a musical group, basically every few years or so, you'd have to go to the Ministry of Culture and you have to get your license renewed. And that was the way they checked up on you and made sure that you were following all the rules. So Renft went to the Ministry of Culture and said, okay, we want to get our license renewed. And they said, no, we're very sorry, but as of right now, you don't exist anymore. And literally overnight, their music disappeared from the entire country. They were no longer played on the radio. All the stores, like all of their records and whatever, disappeared. Recording company catalogs were reprinted so that they were no longer in them. And the state put out a rumor that they had split up, which actually wasn't all that false because 2 of them had been thrown in jail. So that was the type of power that the East German authorities had in the country. Basically, this band, it wasn't as if their music was just banned, it was literally erased from the entire country. So if you were to go shopping in West Germany, basically it would look like any store in Canada. You'd walk in, into a grocery store, you could get whatever you wanted. The shelves had everything that you were looking for. In East Germany, this was not the case at all. Basically, most things that were made in East Germany were junk. They fell apart, they broke, they didn't work, or you just couldn't find them at all. If you went into a grocery store and you were looking for fresh fruits and vegetables, for example, you'd have a hard time finding them. If you wanted milk, if you wanted ketchup, if you wanted toilet paper, these were things that were not easy to come by in East Germany ever. You never knew. So basically what you would do is you would always carry cash. And you would always carry a shopping bag because you never knew when a store might have something. And if there was a lineup outside on the sidewalk, you would just go and stand in it because there was a good chance that whatever it was something that you wanted. Bananas in particular were very rare. So if there were bananas, they were rationed, and you would get 1 banana per person per household. And this would happen maybe a couple of times a year. And that was the same with oranges. So I had a cousin who lived in East Germany her entire life. And when the wall came down and she went to the West for the first time, she told me that she walked into a grocery store and she was so shocked by the amount of stuff that was in there. She said she just stood in the middle of the aisles and she started to cry because she couldn't believe how much they had been denied their whole lives, and they had no idea. Now, of course, there was also a lot of hypocrisy going on. So if you were a regular East German, that was your life. But if you happened to be a high-ranking Communist Party member, that was not your life. There were special stores that only you knew about that sold all the Western stuff that you could ever want. So it was basically like George Orwell's Animal Farm, where all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. Average waiting time to get a telephone in your house was 10 to 12 years. Only 1 in 5 households had a telephone in East Germany. And this was at a time when, like, if you lived in the United States, if you lived in Canada, everybody had a telephone. This was not in like the 1920s. The most popular car in East Germany was called a Trabant. That's a picture of it. Everybody called it a Trabi. It was also a piece of junk. Basically, people thought of it as a cardboard box with an engine. However, it's nice to have a car. So you might want to put your name in, in order to get a car. And then you maybe wait about 15 years and you might get one. There was a joke going around in East Germany that went like this. Why are there no bank robberies in East Germany? And the answer is because you have to wait 15 years for a getaway car. I never completely appreciated what it might feel like to live like this until the pandemic hit. And I'm sure you guys can remember about a year ago when you'd go into a grocery store and you couldn't find toilet paper anywhere, or you couldn't, I went into a grocery store. I don't know what it was like for you guys, but in Vancouver, shelves were bare. And it was the first time in my entire life that I walked into a grocery store and could not find what I wanted. I couldn't get orange juice. I couldn't get salad dressing. I couldn't get flour. There were people going into the meat department and basically loading up their carts with meat just in case they could, didn't get it anymore. And you'd see people, taking armfuls of toilet paper. And then of course the black market came up selling hand sanitizer because nobody could find it. And they were charging $20 a bottle. And I thought, this is what it would have felt like to live in East Germany all the time, because this is what it was always like. And so it was really, a little light went on for me in that sense. It was very interesting to sort of have that feeling and understand what things might have been like. So I know the clothes are bad on either side of the border here, but this was the 1970s, 1980s. But the point being that in the West, you could wear whatever you wanted. In the East, for quite a long time, Levi's were illegal. The reason was that they were considered the mark of the Western devil, and you were not allowed to wear them. In the West, in the 1980s, Star Trek was a very popular show on TV. And basically, of course, as it is now, you could watch whatever you wanted if you lived in the West. In the East, state TV had 2 channels, and they were 100% in line with Communist Party policy. So the picture that I'm showing here is of something it was a show called The Black Channel. And what they would do is that every week they would choose a Western show and they would tear it apart. They would say just how bad it was and how terrible life was in the West. And you don't ever want to go there, and you certainly don't want to live there because everybody is in danger of being homeless, and they don't have jobs, and there's no medical care, and the crime is rampant. So it was all propaganda. And basically, if you wanted to find out what was going on in the world, you didn't want to watch East German television because it was all lies. You had to watch Western TV. But the problem was the Stasi agents would drive around in their cars and they would look to see which direction the television antennas were pointed, because that's the way things worked back then. And if your TV antenna was pointed in the wrong direction, they knew that you were not watching Eastern TV, and then you'd get called into the police station. Now, the other thing they would do is that teachers would get their students to hum the theme of the news program that they listen to at home. And you know how news program starts, there's always that little bit of music at the beginning, right? And it's always the same. And so if you as a student hummed the Western news theme, your teacher knew that your family was watching Western news, and then they would be called in for a little chat and they'd be in trouble. So the danger was that East German citizens could find out what they were missing just by turning their TV on, right? They could see life in the West and they would think, oh my goodness, what are we doing here? Like, this is terrible. We could be living in the West and we could have everything we wanted. And so the point is that the authorities were constantly trying to convince everybody that East Germany was the better place to live. And there were a lot of people who believed this because they were trying to create this ideal society of workers. That's what the whole thing was about. And there were a lot of things in East Germany that actually were better. Prices were lower. There was very little unemployment. There was much more equality between men and women. All women worked. There was the idea of women staying home to take care of babies or whatever was not something that happened in East Germany. There was daycare for everybody. Everybody had medical care. So, and everybody had access to housing. So even though the housing was not that great, but they all had somewhere to live. So there was this ideal that they were working towards, but the casualty was freedom. The government could never allow people to have the free choice. Do you want Eastern or do you want Western? Because they were always afraid that people would choose Western and then the whole ideal would be compromised. So if you were a kid, you would join a group called the Pioneers. This looks like fun. Basically, this was a group that started when you were 7 years old. And just in case you might think that you have a choice about whether you're going to join this group or not, no, you don't have a choice. If you didn't join, basically you would come under the attention of the secret police. They would be considering you possibly an enemy of the state, and you'd be looking for trouble. So you didn't want to do that. No vacations except for to countries that were behind the Iron Curtain. Western magazines, Western newspapers were forbidden. They never really said that books were banned. It's just that you could never get certain books you just couldn't get hold of. And if you happened to have a copy of George Orwell's 1984 or a book, something like that, there was a good chance that you'd be arrested if the authorities saw you with that. So you had to be really, really careful about what you said and to whom at all times. You could never openly criticize the government. You could go to prison for 10 years for doing that. Now, probably what you're thinking is, okay, how could the East German authorities know what you were saying to your friend or what you were saying in your own home or what you were saying to your family? They couldn't possibly be listening to everything and know everything, could they? Well, actually, they could. I remember I told you about that Stasi museum and the methods of surveillance that they had in there. The secret police, the things that they used to keep track of people, it was honestly nothing short of mind-blowing. It was like a James Bond movie. Their mandate was to know everything about everyone. And remember, this was long before the internet, okay? So they did not have the internet, those sorts of means at their hands to be following people around. They controlled people, they monitored, manipulated, ruined people's lives. It's almost hard to believe. They had a network of informants and collaborators that was so extensive. At one point, it was one set of eyes per 60 adults. They listened in on phone calls. They opened mail. They had departments in their headquarters for doing this. And by the 1980s, they were opening 90,000 letters per day. They would disguise themselves as workmen and they'd go into your apartment and they would bug it. So this is an example of a door that's been taken apart so that they can put batteries in there for listening devices. They would hide cameras and microphones in walls, in briefcases, in plants. Here is an example of a button that's actually a camera. So that, the Stasi agent would have his coat on. You would have no idea that he was taking pictures of you, but he was. And as I said, this is like James Bond, right? Except this happened. This is true. And so you could get arrested for telling the wrong kind of joke. That happened to people, even to teenagers, by the way. And you think, well, I'm just telling it to my friend, right? I mean, how is that going to be a problem? Not knowing that your friend is actually an informant. And even within your own family, there were informants. And so you couldn't trust anybody. It was a terrible way to create a society with so much distrust. Now, technically, you could apply to leave East Germany. If you were very unhappy with your situation, you could say to the authorities, okay, I've had enough. I want to go to go to West Germany. I'm going to fill out some forms. But here's what might happen if you did that. First of all, you could be fired from your job. And then you'd start looking for another job and you would realize that nobody will hire you. Rumors would be spread about you, about a problem with alcohol or a drug addiction or some other terrible thing. Your son or daughter would be all set to go to university and they would have great marks and no problem, they're going to get in. They don't get in anywhere. you'd be followed conspicuously so that you felt it. You would come home one day and all the furniture in your apartment had been moved around just so that you knew that they had been there and they were watching you. These were the Stasi's these were their favorite methods of intimidating people and scaring people, and they worked. The idea was to break people down so that they would stay in line, basically punish one person so that 100 people lived in fear. Rebelling was very, very risky. Even if you were a teenager, they put teenagers in prison. If you wanted to go to a university, if you wanted to get a decent job, you had to follow the rules. You had to repeat the slogans, you had to join the pioneers, you had to watch the right TV programs, or you could end up with a factory job for the rest of your life or something a whole lot worse. And sometimes you were faced with the terrible decision of being asked to inform on a friend if you wanted to go to university or if you wanted to get a good job. So this is the other question I would like to ask you guys. What would you do in that situation? If the Stasi came to you and said, hey, your buddy over there, we want to know a little bit more about him. Can you keep an eye on him for us and maybe tell us if he says something that's, not so kosher? And then we'll make sure you get into medical school, or we'll make sure you get the job that you really want. And by the way, if you don't do this, we hope you like the uranium mines, because that's where you're going to be working for the rest of your life. So I'm gonna turn that over to you guys. What would you do in that situation? Would you inform on your friend? What would you do? So I hope you're monitoring the chat if people are putting any answers in.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay, awesome.
Yeah, you guys can type into the chat. Taryn, you can put stuff in there if your students are sharing.
Just
how would you feel in that situation? Excuse me.
It's a nasty question. I know. I'm sorry.
It's an interesting one to think about, though.
Yeah, well, people were put in that situation all the time, that the authorities would approach them and say, we want some information. How about you help us? And if you don't help us, here's what's going to happen. So, yeah. If I can leave it for you guys to think about, if people just want to.
Rosine said she wouldn't turn in her friends.
Okay.
And that it would be very difficult. Yeah, it would be a terribly difficult situation.
It's a terrible situation to be put in. It's a very unfair question to ask anybody, because there isn't really any right answer. I mean, you don't want to turn your friends in, but you don't also want to work in the uranium mines, because it was very dangerous and you'd probably end up with cancer. So yeah, it's bad. But I will continue. No good choice. No, there's no good answer. But I don't have much better things to tell you about either. So I'll just continue and tell you some more of the bad stuff that happened there. So another thing that the Stasi did is they kept something called a smell bank. So what they would do is they would call you into their station, and you would not realize it, but you'd be sitting on one of these little yellow cloths. And after the meeting, they would take the yellow cloth and they put it in a pickle jar. And that way they had your scent. So then if there was a crime scene or something where they suspected that something was wrong, they would bring in dogs, and the dogs would smell around at the scene. And then they'd go to all the little pickle jars and they'd smell the scents, and they'd, maybe name you as a suspect in some supposed crime. So they did that. They also kept files on people. They knew intimate details about you. They knew who your boyfriend or girlfriend was. They knew if your family had money problems. They knew which books you took out of the library. They knew what you wanted to do as a career, and they held on to this information so that they could use it against you. So by the time the wall came down, there was 100 kilometers of shelving full of files like this, and 16,000 bags of shredded documents. If you wanted to read all of that, it would take you 7,000 years. And that's if you read every minute of every day. By the time people stormed the Stasi headquarters and went inside, they found 39 million index cards of information that was kept on people. So we take our freedom for granted. because we've always had it. Anybody who's lived in North America, basically their whole lives. I mean, we're used to being able to do more or less whatever we want. Now, the pandemic has given us maybe a tiny little taste of what it feels like when some of those freedoms are taken away. And as I recall, we haven't enjoyed that very much. Now, if you think that there's nowhere in the world anymore where people's freedom is threatened to this extent, think again. China is developing something called the social credit system. And basically it's like a credit check, except it applies to all of your behavior to see if you're trustworthy and to sort of see what you're up to in your life. So basically, if you're caught jaywalking, or if you play your music too loud on the train, or if you don't pay a bill on time, you lose points. And if you lose enough points, you lose certain rights. So all of a sudden you'll go to book a train ticket, and you'll find out that you're not allowed to travel there anymore because you've lost too many points. Now, if you belong to a targeted ethnic minority in China, you can be sent to what they call a re-education camp. Technically, the government calls it a vocational education and training center, but I think that we can probably tell from this picture that that's not what it is. Now, we can also talk about other things that are allowed or not allowed in this world. So, for example, women being allowed to drive a car. You would think that a woman or a girl anywhere in the world would be allowed to drive a car, right? No. This young woman, who is actually a UBC grad, her name is Lujain Al-Hathlul. She went back to Saudi Arabia after she'd studied at UBC, and she was advocating for women to be allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia. And they arrested her for espionage and national security violations, and she spent over 1,000 days in prison. And I would think that there would have been a good chance that she'd still be there if people had not advocated for her and made a huge fuss on her behalf. And this just happened, by the way. This is not, 15, 20 years ago. This was like this year. So all she was advocating was for women to be allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia. Reading Harry Potter, you'd think that you could do that anywhere in the world, but actually, well, first of all, there's a school in Nashville, Tennessee, in the United States, where you are not allowed to read Harry Potter because it is considered magic, and just, I don't know exactly why they don't want you reading it, but they don't. And if you live in the United Arab Emirates, you also will not have access to any Harry Potter because it is banned in the United Arab Emirates. LGBTQ, not only is it illegal in 70 countries, there are places where you can actually be put to death for being LGBTQ. And these places include Iran, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Sudan, and some provinces in Somalia and Nigeria. Any of you guys out there have a ponytail or a mullet? If you live in Iran, they would make you get a haircut. You are not allowed to have a ponytail. It is considered a Western hairstyle, and it is not allowed in Iran. I don't know if anybody around has a mustache. I looked high and low for a country where mustaches were not allowed, and I did not find one. So if you have a mustache, you can go anywhere you want. So for whatever reason, mustaches are allowed everywhere. So I'm going to leave you with one of my favorite quotes from a philosopher named Baruch Spinoza. And he says, if you want the present to be different from the past. Now, I never used to really be all that interested in history, but since I've started writing historical fiction and started reading up on all of this stuff, I have become convinced that learning about history and reading historical fiction is a really important way of keeping our eyes open, because things tend to repeat in history. And I think that it's very important to know what has happened so that we can guard against it ever happening again. No one expected things like Nazi Germany. No one expected the Berlin Wall to get built. We need to know that these things are possible so that we can make sure that they never happen again. So thank you all very much for listening. I'm going to leave you with some pictures, as I promised, of my cat. She has a very bad attitude, as you can probably tell from these pictures, but she is my roommate and my constant companion. And so there you go. So I hope you guys have questions. I'm very happy to answer anything about whether it's something that I've talked about or anything about writing or whatever, any comments that you might want to have. Now is the time to ask them.
Thank you, Michelle.
You're welcome.
That is one very comfortable looking cat.
Yes.
Comfortable with its life and who it is as a cat.
Yes. Yeah, she doesn't, she's not ashamed of her weight. She loves to eat and loves to do nothing. So there you go.
Awesome. So one question we've got, what advice would you give to young people about writing?
Oh, okay. Well, that's an interesting question. The first thing I would say is that you should read as much as you possibly can. Reading is a great way to find out what's already out there and to actually absorb writing lessons without even realizing it. Like you're having a good time reading a book and you're actually learning how to write at the same time without even realizing that that's what you're doing. And you're also picking up lots of vocabulary and things like that. And you're getting a sense for the shape of a story, how a story works, how it works to have a main character who's actually out there doing things and having a goal and all of that sort of thing. And so reading is it's probably one of the most important things you can do. And the other really important thing, of course, is to write as much as you can. When I was young, I kept a journal, and I still keep a journal, but not quite as much as I used to, just because time constraints more than anything. But I think you write as much as you can and read as much as you can. And those are the two main things. Maybe the third thing I would say is to try to, this is going to be unpopular, try to stay off social media as much as you can. Because from what I have read and from my own experiences, social media is really quite destructive when it comes to our powers of concentration. It makes us fragmented a little bit and sort of, you're doing one thing and then your phone makes a beep and you have to check the text and then you have an email. So you got to go there. And then you're bouncing around all over the place and you're not focusing on one thing. And when you lose the ability to focus like that, it makes it really hard to be a writer. So I know that's probably not what you want to hear, but limiting social media is probably a pretty good idea.
Good advice. From the class, that's all great advice. Thank you. Other questions from the class? I'll throw one at you in the meantime.
Sure. Yeah.
Where do you write? Do you have are you a longhand person? Are you a typer? Do you like a cozy chair? What makes it easy for you to write in terms of where you write?
Well, that's an interesting question because basically the answer is yes to all, to everything. I have an office in my apartment. I'm very lucky to have a space where I keep my books and I have a big desk and everything. So usually I start off there, but then as the day progresses, I migrate. So I'll end up at my couch for a while or at my kitchen table. And I do a combination of longhand and typing. Longhand is a very interesting thing. I've belonged to writers groups before where we meet, well, before the pandemic, of course, we used to meet in person and we would write longhand. We'd have prompts that we would use and we'd sit and write. And the thing that I discovered with that is that longhand writing produces very different work than typing does. I don't really know why. I think studies have been done in terms of how it accesses different parts of your brain. And I also think, of course, because I personally cannot write as fast as I can type, I have to slow down. And somehow, I don't know what it is that you're more willing to make mistakes. You're more willing to make a mess, I guess, because when you're typing, it all looks so nice and clean that you sort of think, okay, I've got to get this right. I can't just sort of go and do whatever I want. And when you're writing longhand, you can doodle, you can draw a circle around something and put an arrow and say, no, this or whatever. I feel a little bit freer when I'm writing longhand. So I actually do try to write longhand as much as I can. And I sort of developed a process for myself when I'm writing the first draft of a new novel. I will do as much of it in longhand as I can. I get impatient after a while. My hand gets tired. It's long. It takes longer. I get frustrated. But I really think that writing longhand is very valuable. So I do a lot more of it maybe than some writers might. So yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Asako asks, how long does it take you, or did it take you to write your books?
It depends very much on the book. The House of 1000 Eyes was probably the novel that I wrote fastest. ever with the least amount of problems. I do not know why that is. I have been trying ever since then to replicate that experience, and it has not worked very well. So for whatever reason, I had a good idea for a story. I sat down and I thought it out, and I sat down and wrote it, and it worked. And really, that is an anomaly. It doesn't usually work like that. For example, my long list of impossible things, I'll tell you, this is the other side of the game. So I had written a first draft of that novel first, before I even thought about writing The House of 1000 Eyes. And I finished it, I set it aside, and I thought, okay, I'm going to write The House of 1000 Eyes because I've got this great idea. I want to get it down on paper. Came back to my long list of impossible things, and it was a very long draft. It was like 450 pages or something. Read through it and thought, oh no, this is not good. It's not working. I don't like it. And I basically had to take most of it. And I mean, I say I threw it in the garbage. I don't really throw it in the garbage. I sort of put it somewhere so that I know that it's still there if I need it. But I basically had to start over again. I used some of the same characters, but the entire story is different. You wouldn't even recognize, if you sat the two of them next to each other and read them both, you'd be hard pressed to believe that one came from the other one. They're so different. So that was a very frustrating experience. And that is maybe more the reality than what happened with The House of 1000 Eyes. I tend to, you write a first draft, you think it's great, you leave it alone for a while, you come back to it and you think, oh, it's actually not as great as I thought. And you have to start, not necessarily start over again, but you have to sit down with it again and wrestle it to the ground and figure out what's wrong with it and why, and try to shape it into something a little bit better than it was, which is what I'm doing with the novel I'm working on right now. I did think it was great, and now I don't anymore. So, yeah.
Just a note from Jackie at Chinook. I appreciate your novels, as I too have German heritage and have seen the Berlin Wall before it was torn down.
Oh,
we
wow.
also got to see East Berlin and the horrible conditions that they had to live in. The shelves in the stores were bare, but yet you had to convert a certain amount of money and spend that money before going back to West Berlin.
Yeah, I remember reading about that. That's right. If you wanted to come over to the East, you had to spend money there. And I mean, on what? You know, that was the problem. Like, people had the stuff that they made, like, I can't use the word because I will use a bad word. So I don't want to do that. But they had a term for that in the East, when the stuff that was just junk, that anything that was from the East, it was just junk, and it would break, and but you'd buy an Eastern pen and it would leak, and like, you just didn't want anything that was Eastern, but then you didn't have any access to anything that was Western. So it was very frustrating and hard for people. I honestly don't know how people managed through there. It would have been terrible.
Jackie says, we all bought East German flags and you could see through it.
That's right. Yeah.
Thin little flags. It sounds like.
That doesn't surprise me at all. That's funny. Yeah.
Excellent. Any other questions for Michelle? It's been a very interesting chat. I feel like I know a lot more things now than I did before.
Oh, that's good. That's good. I'm glad.
All right. Taryn said that that's all of the questions. Oh, Jackie would like to know, though, what are your book plans for the future?
Oh, okay. Well, so I'm working on one right now, the one that I thought was great and then found out wasn't. That is set in 1929, just before the Nazis come to power, which I find is a very, very interesting time period, because when you don't impose hindsight on that time period, there was no guarantee that the Nazis were going to come to power. It was not a done deal. They were really not that popular back at that time. But they were there. The Hitler Youth was there. The stormtroopers were there. And there was a lot of violence on the streets. There was a lot of anti-Semitism. So all the seeds were planted, but it wasn't necessarily yet the case that things were going to turn out the way they did. And so I find that to be super interesting. And I have a character who doesn't intend to get seduced by the Hitler Youth, but sort of gets involved in it and gets swept up in it against his will. It's because the Hitler Youth back at that time, it was, I hate to say this, but it was like for kids, it was a fun group. That's how they sort of got people involved, right? There was camping, that you went out without your parents, you went out and, you know, out hiking and stuff like that. And they made it into something fun. And that was one of the ways they sort of got people involved. So, so I find that to be a super interesting time period. And so that's, I'm working on a novel set in that time period, but I'm also working, I've almost finished a novel for adults that's set in the future in Canada, like about 100 years from now. And basically what the way I've envisioned it, of course, there's environmental catastrophe and all sorts of terrible things happen. And there's too many people, essentially. So what the government finally realizes they have to do in order to manage the scarce resources and have everybody be able to live is they develop something called the Ministry of Sleep. And basically everybody, by the time you hit age 25, you have to sleep for 6 months of the year. So they have this whole network of underground pods, and you know, you have a sensor in your neck, and your sensor rings at a certain time, and you have no choice. You got to get in the elevator, you got to go down to your pod, and you have to sleep for 6 months. So my main character is a doctor, and when she comes back from her 6 months sleep, she realizes that stuff has been happening that she didn't really know about, and things are not looking so good. And then somebody gets murdered and she doesn't understand why, and she gets framed for it. And because she's been sleeping for 6 months, she doesn't know what's going on. So so basically that's the story. So I've got sort of these two projects happening at the same time, which is not a good idea, by the way. It's better to just focus on one, but that's what happened during the pandemic. I had a little more time on my hands, so I wrote 2 books instead of 1. And yeah, so that's what I'm working on right now.
Very cool. All right. Well, thank you again. I feel like I'm saying thanks a lot. And the school people are saying thank you as well. On behalf of Chinook High School, thank you so much, Michelle, for your wonderful presentation. Thank you to Paige for setting this all up and hosting. My pleasure. It was very much fun to do this on behalf of the Lethbridge Public Library. We do have Michelle's books available in our collection, and I believe Jackie has them in your school library as well. So those are available for you to borrow and to read, and hopefully this has encouraged you to pick them up.
Well, thank you so much, you guys. Thank you, Paige, for getting this organized and set up. And thank you to everybody for listening. And I wish you all the best during the pandemic. I hope everybody stays healthy and safe. And yeah, nice to chat with you all.
Excellent. Have a great rest of your week,
Okay.
Michelle.
Yeah. Bye. Thank you, everybody.
Say hi to your cat for us.
I will.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.